Hi everyone, I'm Steve Jones from Newsmag Renfrew. The Supreme Court of the United States is in crisis. It may not realize it itself. The membership of that court might not realize that it's in crisis, but it is. That's because it's becoming more and more under the scrutiny of various other institutions and other vested interests and the public at large, and people who have concerns over the direction that the court is going. And so all of this questioning as to the veracity or the validity of certain judgments brings the court into a measure of disrepute, which by that I mean that it's not trusted by a large number of Americans. And of course, when you've got that, you don't have an ideal situation. You want it so that all of your citizens of your nation view the Supreme Court as a trustworthy arbiter or decision-making that has an important role in how life in the United States moves forward. And so the rulings that it renders on certain topics change the lives of millions of Americans. And so obviously we want to have as balanced and as impartial a body as possible. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States, or SCOTUS, as it is known by its acronym, it's been compromised. And it's been compromised by the political, how do I put this, the political machinations? The machinations? I think that's a word. The political intrigue, the political machinery, the political attempts to appoint justices or associate justices to the Supreme Court that reflect the ideology of certain political parties, i.e. the political party in power. You know, the last three nominations made by any president was made by a Republican president, and that would be Donald Trump. And that caused the court to lurch dramatically to the right side of the political spectrum. So we don't have a balanced Supreme Court anymore. What we have is basically a 6-3 conservative majority. I don't know if there are formal attempts to keep it balanced in the past, but by and large that was done rather successfully, whether on purpose or not. But all that went out the window with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And the reason why Donald Trump made such a big difference is he was in a position to actually name 3 Supreme Court justices during his term, including one, Amy Coney Barrett, in the final days of his administration, which, according to leading conservatives or leading Republicans like Mitch McConnell, that's just not done. You don't do that as an outgoing president. You leave that appointment to the president coming in. But McConnell will change his position on that as it suits his convenience. So anyways, you may recall back in 2016, it was President Barack Obama who was in power, but he was sort of a lame duck president, if you will. Something happened in late 2016, or not late 2016, but actually February 2016, with the death of Associate Justice Antonin Scalia, who was a Supreme Court justice and who had the great misfortune of dying. And that left a vacancy open on the Supreme Court. And Obama went ahead in an attempt to fill that vacancy, and he nominated an appellate court judge by the name of Merrick Garland, who is now the U.S. Attorney General, as his nominee for the Supreme Court. But at that time, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who I mentioned before, said that there was no way that the Republicans were going to have any role to play in making sure that Garland was confirmed, because, as McConnell stated quite clearly and in public, that it shouldn't be a president in the waning days of his presidency that makes such an important pick. It should be the new president, armed with a 4-year term up in front of him, that should be making such a substantial pick. And so basically McConnell said, we're not going to let any movement on this confirmation go forward. And of course, without ratification in the Senate, and the Republicans held the Senate majority at the time, there was no way Merrick Garland was going to be successful at being appointed to the Supreme Court. And so that's that. Then we get Donald Trump, who won the 2016 election, and he's the new president with 4 years of runway ahead of him here. And he comes along at a time when there are numerous vacancies coming up in the Supreme Court. And part of his campaign promises, especially to the evangelical and Christian right, were to specifically name conservative-leaning justices to the Supreme Court. Now, the main target there was abortion, which is the primary issue for those interest groups that I mentioned before. And so he was true to his word. I mean, when he came to power, the first thing he did was, with respect to the opening caused by the death of Scalia, he appointed Neil Gorsuch, who is a conservative-leaning justice, to the Supreme Court. And subsequent to that, he nominated and had confirmed Brett Kavanaugh. And in the last days of his administration, despite what Mitch McConnell might have said prior to that, he nominated and had confirmed Amy Coney Barrett as the third of his judicial nominees to the Supreme Court, and she as well is a conservative. So, what you've got here is the addition of 3 conservative justices that are going to join the 3 conservative justices that are already on the Supreme Court, and that would be Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and of course the Chief Justice himself, John Roberts. They're all conservatives, and now with the 3 additional conservatives coming on board, the Supreme Court now has a 6-3 majority with respect to small c conservatives versus small l liberals. The difference is showing. So the court, as it's now constituted, has rendered several decisions, but I think primary among those in terms of notoriety would be the landmark case, the landmark 1973 decision known as Roe v. Wade, which was the decision that gave women the right to choose it gave women reproductive rights over their body, and so if they so chose to have an abortion, they could do so constitutionally. And this case was the landmark case for, ever since 1973. So now here we are in 2022 is when the decision was rendered, or I think maybe early 2023. Anyways, some 50 years after it was first decided, the current Supreme Court overruled it and basically threw out 50 years worth of jurisprudence. Now, it's interesting, in that 50 years, there have been 4 Republican presidents. Those would be Presidents Ford, President Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and George W. Bush. But these guys, even though they had cracks at appointing justices to the Supreme Court, I don't recall any of them jumping up and down and making sure that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned or anything like that. And so, it's interesting that these 4 prior Republican presidents, having the opportunity to do so, did not take the opportunity to do so, and they left Roe v. Wade as the existing precedent regarding women's reproductive rights. And so, like I said, it was Roe v. Wade, it was with that case in mind that evangelicals and Christian nationalists and people of that ilk began to heavily support the candidacy of Donald Trump, both politically and financially, so that he would, and that was the bald promise, that he would get into office and then he would use his power as president to nominate and have confirmed more right-wing leaning conservatives to the Supreme Court with a view to scrapping Roe v. Wade. Now, to be precise here, but it's not like the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was illegal, or it's not that they ruled that women could not constitutionally get an abortion. What the Supreme Court ruled was that abortion and women's reproductive rights were within the jurisdictional purview of the states and the division of powers as they exist between the federal government and the state governments, of which there are 50. And so they believe, and of course the American system has as part of its nature a very strong states' rights element to it. And what that leads to is basically a hodgepodge quilt of this, that, and everything, where one thing's allowed in one state, but in the state next door it's not allowed. And so that's what's happened with reproductive rights and abortion, is that some states will allow it, and it's legal in those states, but then the legislature in the state next door has decided that it won't be allowable and it won't be legal in its jurisdiction rather. And so what you get is this, as I said, this patchwork or this hodgepodge of different legalities with respect to an important right, that, different things to different states, rather than a uniform approach across the entirety of the United States. And so what you've got here is your typical American chaotic political structural defect that they have so many of. That's really surprising, but there you have it. Roe v. Wade is just one example. It's a fairly significant example, but it's just one example of the kind of thing that can change with this Supreme Court. I know that there is some talk about revisiting same-sex marriage rights, if true. And there is pressure on the Supreme Court to do that from the evangelical Christians and the fundamentalist Christians and the Christian nationalists and that whole political mob. But if same-sex marriage rights are going to be looked at, then I would imagine that the LGBTQ community would probably have some legitimate concerns moving forward as to whether their rights are going to be recognized and upheld, or whether they're going to be rolled back. And so what we have here is something that's led to an outcry for reform of the Supreme Court. And just because things can be rolled back so easily. Look at Roe v. Wade. Like I said, it was a landmark jurisprudence until the court decided, well, okay, let's revisit it again. And this time, let's put the ideological filters of 6 members of the conservative majority into this issue. And ping, 50 years later, it just turns on its head, and now all of a sudden you got people scrambling all over the United States to ascertain what they may or may not have to do in order to secure an abortion, if that's something that they wish to do. So there are a number of things that have come to the forefront in terms of if you want to reform the Supreme Court, what would that look like? What kind of things could you do to cause reform to take place in the Supreme Court? So one of the first things that I heard of is something called court packing or court stacking. And so this is where some people will say to Joe Biden, who's currently the president and a Democrat right now, okay, Joe, listen, if you want to change the makeup or if you want to change the balance of the Supreme Court, all you need to do is just appoint a whole bunch of additional Supreme Court justices. Because you're a Democrat, make sure that they're sort of liberal-minded. And make sure you appoint enough of them to at least secure the balance of the Supreme Court, or even appoint enough of them so that you regain the majority of the Supreme Court. And that's all well and good. But where does that stop? I mean, does that mean that if one president can do it, that means another president can do it, unless there's some rule that stipulates how any president might be able to pack the court, but who's going to make that rule? Where are we going to have that rule settled? I mean, we've got a place where Congress or the Senate are both politically deadlocked. I mean, they can't even agree on what day of the week it is. How are they going to come up with a bipartisan formula that guarantees that this court stacking thing isn't done in a way that's actually more harmful than beneficial? And another thing, too, I mean, right now the Supreme Court has 9 members. How many members of a Supreme Court are you willing to have? I mean, right now we've got a Senate that has 100 members. Are we going to have a Supreme Court that someday, because of court stacking, rivals the membership of the Senate? I mean, of course not. That's just an entirely unwieldy thing. And to me, it just doesn't seem like the right way to go. It seems like, if I don't like the way the court looks, I'm going to change the rules and I'm going to appoint a whole bunch of additional justices, and nobody says I can't. And the founding fathers, God bless them with all their wisdom, they never said I could or couldn't. And so, I'm going to do it anyways. Well, I don't think that's really the way to go about things. And all you're really doing when you do that kind of thing is you're just asking for the other side to do the same thing when they're in power. Term limits would be a good idea, I suppose, if justices were to be elected. But I mean, my goodness, they're already politicized enough just by the nature of their appointments. Having an elected judiciary, that's just okay. So now you're going to have people. I know in the States you can run for district attorney, for county sheriff, which is you got the chief prosecutor in the criminal justice system. You've got the sheriff, the county sheriff, who's the chief law enforcement official in a certain jurisdiction, and those are elected positions. But that kind of cheapens them. Because you're turning something into a popularity contest, or you're running the risk of that, more so a contest of credibility or a contest of impartiality or those sorts of things. So my view on the term limits or staggering term limits like they do in the House and in the Senate, a novel idea, but in my mind it just further politicizes the court. And I think the court is politicized enough as it is. We already have the legislative branch and the executive branch is politicized. I mean, all those are elected responsibilities. So it's in my view, it's better to have a Supreme Court that sits outside of that direct political involvement. People who don't owe their jobs to the fickleness. The fickle nature of the American voting public. Mind you, I mean, like I said, the Supreme Court's in crisis because of politics right now, but they don't need to exacerbate that problem by going down the road of terms and term limits. Another possibility is how about ensuring a balanced Supreme Court? Now, how are you going to do that? Well, I don't know. This is just a potential reform. I'm not advocating for it, but I mean, some people will say it's as simple as, okay, well, Democrats will select Democrat-leaning, liberal-leaning justices for the Supreme Court, and Republicans will do the same on their side of the political spectrum, nominating and confirming small c conservative justices for the Supreme Court. But I don't know what the mechanism is or how that works structurally. When a Democrat president is in power, they're only allowed to nominate Democrat-leaning justices, and when Republican presidents are in power, they're only allowed to nominate Republican-leaning justices. And by that I mean, let's say, for example, a conservative justice dies or retires. If a Democrat's in power, they can't name a replacement. But you have to wait for a Republican to come into power, and then the Republican can name the replacement, and vice versa if a Democratic justice were to die or to retire. It seems a little unwieldy, and perhaps I haven't explained that all that well. But to me, again, while in the ideal, it sounds like the idea of a balanced Supreme Court has merit. I just don't know if that's a workable way in which to do it. And also, who makes the call? Who gets to make the decision on the Chief Justice, who is the tiebreaker, right? Who gets to call that? And so there we go again. Are we going to have the House of Representatives decide that? Are we going to have the Senate and the House of Representatives decide that? Because they can't even decide on basic, simple things because they're so hyper-partisan that they can't stand supporting each other's initiatives. How are they going to get themselves together and be bipartisan over the selection of the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court? It just doesn't seem that that's anything that's going to happen. So how about this? A made-in-Canada solution. It's not made in Canada, but we use it here and it works just fine. How about age limitations. How about mandatory retirement of justices? Now in Canada, our Supreme Court justices have to retire at age 75. In the United States, you don't have to retire at all, and you can take your title all the way to the grave with you. And it doesn't matter how feeble-minded you may become in your later years. And I'm not, I'm not doing an age bias thing. I am somewhat aged myself. But sometimes people fall into cognitive decline. Some people just fall into general overall reduced health. And yet, for some reason, they stick it out despite their frailties, and I don't understand that. It's not like they make enough money that it's worthwhile hanging around, just for the paycheck. I think for some of them, their ideals keep them from retiring because they're thinking, okay, well, if I retire, the current president's going to nominate somebody who's like on the other side of the political spectrum for me, so I'm going to hang on for as long as I can. Ruth Bader Ginsburg almost struck me as somebody who was hanging on as best she could, just so that she could get past the election and allow hopefully a Democrat to name the next justice for the Supreme Court. But unfortunately for Ruth, and unfortunately for the nation, so far as I'm concerned, she died in time for President Trump to name Amy Coney Barrett in her place. So, mandatory retirement, some critics will say, well, you've got some, not everybody's brain dead at age 75. You're consigning to pasture some brilliant legal minds. Okay, fair enough. But what about when these people were nominated in the first place? Were we not looking for impartial, brilliant legal minds back then? I mean, I thought shouldn't we have that all settled and sorted back in the nomination and confirmation process? So it's just the cost of doing business. I mean, there's no ideal, perfect way to do it, but mandatory retirement certainly does get rid of some of the problems that are currently being experienced by the Supreme Court of the United States. Something that ought to happen here, and this should be universally acceptable, is the idea of a code of conduct. We kind of have expectations of conduct with all sorts of things. We require code of ethics for all manner of government employees and even non-government employees, and yet we don't have one for the Supreme Court. So, the question that I have is, how do we have a guy like Clarence Thomas who accepts, so he accepts vacations and travel and entertainment from a Texas billionaire who happens to be a significant Republican Party donor. How is that not a conflict of interest? Okay, so let's say an election was so close, like it was back in 2000 with George Bush and Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle? Dan Quayle. And the Supreme Court decided who was going to be president because it was that close. Well, are you going to tell me that you want Clarence Thomas sitting there deciding who's going to be the next president when he's taking vacations from this Texas billionaire who is a large donor to the Republican Party? The optics of that are entirely all wrong. And yet, he didn't disclose any of that. He doesn't seem to have a problem with that. I think we're just supposed to trust his inviolability. I'm not going to use that word. We're going to trust his integrity. But no, I don't want to trust his integrity because honestly, I don't feel he has any. What about the fact that this same Texas billionaire paid off the mortgage of Clarence's mother's house? How about that? Or how about this same Texas billionaire paying for the tuition for Clarence Thomas's son to go to university? Anywhere else that's a conflict of interest, right? But not in Clarence Thomas's mind, and obviously not in the mind of Republican-leaning people who support small c conservative justices on the Supreme Court. Another thing, too. So let's take a look for a second at the spouse of Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. Once again, Clarence. His wife, Ginny Thomas, is a hardcore Republican lobbyist. I think I can say that. That's a a fair thing to say. She is somebody who canvasses donors to the Republican Party. She herself is a donor to the Republican Party, but I don't know by how much, so I'm not going to, certainly on a smaller scale. She's a Trump loyalist. She is an election denier. And so let's just say, for the sake of argument, the Supreme Court had to decide who was going to be president because of an extremely close election. So, do we want Associate Justice Clarence Thomas to be sitting on that court, participating in that decision, when his wife is a Republican Party lobbyist and operator and election denier? That is a conflict of interest. There's no getting around that. And so, I'm just going to put Clarence Thomas out there as the number one reason. He is the poster boy of why the Supreme Court should be reformed along many avenues of reform, but particularly with respect to a code of conduct. Because if there was a code of conduct, this guy would be out on his fat ass, which is exactly where he belongs. But it's America, so they don't have a code of ethics or a code of conduct for their Supreme Court. Listen, it's fine to talk about reform, but we have to understand there will be absolutely no reform of the Supreme Court of the United States unless significant changes are going to be made to the Constitution of the United States. And could you imagine? It's already hyper-political, hyper-partisan already in the United States. How would they ever possibly come together on a series of reforms and agree to them so that it meshes with the Constitution as it's interpreted by justices? Anyways, as in many things American, any kind of change, any attempt to change could be messy business. For Newsmag Renfrew, I'm Steve Jones.